Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to the first in our series of webinars organised by the Oxford Net Zero Project and the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. Welcome to you who are joining us here in Oxford, and a very warm welcome to many people who are joining us online. My name's James Allen. I work at OLAB, a Brazilian food systems consultancy, and I'm going to be moderating our session today. Really excited about it. The session itself is going to be led with research presented by Aline Soterroni. And Aline's doing some really interesting work looking at the synergies between nature-based solutions and zero net emissions targets as well. So we're going to be looking a little bit deeper into Aline's work. And that's part of this series. We go. So what Aline's work looks at is firstly the integrity of net zero, and particularly the socio-ecological sustainability of it. So we're going to land that in Brazil, and our panelists today all have direct experience either through research, through government, or through practice of working in Brazil. So just to frame the discussion, I wanted to make two quick points and then explain a couple of terms, and then we hand straight over to Aline. So the first point I just wanted to share with you as we start is to stress the relationship between climate change and biodiversity loss, which for many of us may be obvious, but that's our starting point to understand that relationship. And the second is the relationship between deforestation and agriculture, right? So I think if we understand those better, we also understand better the relationship between net zero and zero deforestation. So on that first point, we do know that burning fossil fuels is the main cause of climate change. Number 2 in that ranking is land use. And key to land use is forests. And one of the main drivers of forest loss is agriculture. What's interesting is in the main agricultural frontier, which is the Cerrado, the Brazilian Cerrado, the savanna of Brazil, where you produce soy and beef in that area, soy, for example, 1 ton of soy that's produced in the Cerrado produces approximately 1 ton of CO2. And about half of that 1 ton of CO2 comes from land use changes. So what that means is if you expand agriculture over forest and you lose that forest, you lose the mitigation capacity of that forest. Okay, so a low cost and effective way of addressing climate change is addressing the causes of deforestation, and that's where we want to land the discussion today. I guess the key message that my colleagues and panelists are going to be talking about then is the critical role that nature plays in net zero plans. And Aline and her team presented last year really interesting results from research addressed to the Brazilian government on their net zero pledges. And what that showed was that the mitigating potential of NBS in Brazil's net zero pledge, if implementation of a successful zero deforestation policy, would count towards between 50 and 60% of Brazil's commitments on climate. The second point I just wanted to quickly touch upon is the relationship between agriculture and biodiversity loss. Many of you may be familiar with this, but it's worth a reminder. Brazil is the world's largest deforestation frontier, often in the area between the 2 key biomes of the Cerrado and the Amazon. It's the world's second largest producer of beef, produces around 10 million tons per year. And it's the world's leading soy producer. So those 2, soy and beef in particular, are key drivers of deforestation. Around 40% of global deforestation can be attributed to the beef trade, and more than half of that is Brazilian beef. Okay, so if we're serious about addressing deforestation, Brazilian beef is a really key place to start. And about 1/5 of deforestation across the globe is drawn from oil seeds, particularly soy and palm. And soy is the world's most internationally traded commodity. Okay, so we're going to be looking today particularly at soy and beef and the potential to reduce the role that they play in driving deforestation, particularly in Brazil. What's really exciting today is we've got this wonderful mix of academics, practitioners, and policymakers. And I think that's what makes this particular session quite unique. So in addition to Aline and Rachel, Aline is Fellow in Nature-Based Solutions and Oxford Net Zero here at the University of Oxford. Rachel Garrett is Moran Professor of Conservation and Development at the University of Cambridge, both doing quite important work. Aline does a lot of work on mathematical modelling around deforestation, and Rachel a lot of work on environmental policies. I'm delighted to say that after Aline, we've got Fabiola Zerbini from the Brazilian government. Fabiola is Director of the Department of Forest at the Ministry of the Environment in Brazil. And following on from Fabiola is André Vasconcelos, who is Global Engagement Lead at Trace. And Trace does a lot of important work on gathering and analysing data on trade of commodities and how to promote more sustainable trade among those commodities. So just before I hand over to Aline, I think it's really important that I just clarify a couple of terms that you're going to be hearing us use quite a bit today. Okay, we're going to be talking particularly from a legislative perspective. So to what degree can new legislation coming out of the EU and existing legislation in Brazil influence deforestation and its relationship with soy and beef? The first term we're going to be using is EUDR, EU Deforestation Regulation. So the EUDR is a groundbreaking piece of legislation that's been put into the statute books this year and will come into force in 2025, and looks at avoiding deforestation linked to commodity imports into the EU through due diligence. It looks at 8 commodities: soy and beef, palm oil, cocoa, coffee, and 3 others. Okay, and in a nutshell, what it says is, if an agricultural commodity that's imported into the EU came from a piece of land, either the beef was produced on that piece of land or the soy was planted on that piece of land, if it came from a piece of land on which there was deforestation after December 2020, it becomes illegal to import that. Okay, so that's what the EUDR does. And it applies to what have been defined as high-risk areas, including Brazil. The second piece in our glossary that's important for us to know about today is a piece called Other Wooded Land. And this is where we start getting a little bit into the weeds of this regulation, but the devil is in the detail. So Other Wooded Land, or this wonderful acronym of OWL, what's important about Other Wooded Land is how is the EU defining what a forest is? Okay, so for us in this room here, a forest may obviously be an area with a large number of trees. But what do we really mean by that? That if you have 5 trees on a piece of land, is that still a forest if you have 10? So existing legislation uses the FAO definition. And the FAO definition is, there's a lot of detail to this, but it's basically trees that are higher than 5 meters, the canopy cover of more than 10%. So more than 10% of that piece of land, at least half an hectare, is covered by tree canopy. That's the FAO definition of forests. Now, the EU is discussing going into a more refined definition of what forest would mean, to include other wooded land. Okay, and what that means is, and that's particularly important for places like the Cerrado, which are a savanna and have really important root systems when it comes to climate change. Okay, but in the Cerrado, other wooded land would include canopies of between 5 and 10%, and include shrubs, bushes, and trees. Okay. So what we're basically saying is, if we move the dial on how we understand forests, what are going to be the impacts on net zero targets and deforestation? And Aline is going to say a lot about that. EUDR and OWL, remember those. And then finally, the Brazilian Forest Code. And I know a lot of people in here will be familiar with that. But Brazil has very rigorous environmental legislation. Okay, and that's an important starting point for our discussion today. Brazil requires landowners to maintain a percentage of their property as native vegetation. That percentage changes depending on which bit of Brazil you're in. If you're in the Amazon, generally speaking, you can only clear 20% of that land. 80% of it has to be retained as native vegetation. That number changes a little bit in certain circumstances in certain states, but just for you to have an idea that actually landowners under Brazilian law are quite limited to how much they can deforest. And the Cerrado, which is the savanna, 65% they can plant on, 35% has to retain forests. That's the Brazilian Forest Code. Finally, and then I'll hand over straight over to you, Aline. China is an important player in this. China is an important player because Brazil's main trading partner on agricultural commodities is China. Okay, so about 50% of Brazilian soy is exported to China. China has made some important, if long-distance, commitments on climate. So it has a 2060 pledge to reach net zero. What that means is the Chinese government is looking at the EU legislation and is exploring what may come out of China in terms of legislation. Okay, and we're going to touch upon that today as well. I think Andre is going to bring that up. I think critically what China is particularly interested in is ensuring that any soy or beef that comes out of Brazil complies with Brazilian law, so complies with the forest code. And the fact is, at the moment, it doesn't always. So you've got this fantastic legislation in Brazil, but often what happens is the soy and beef that comes out of Brazil hasn't fully complied with that legislation. So how do we ensure improved compliance with the legislation? Okay, that's it from me. I hope that tees us up and gives us a chance to really understand how we're going to frame this discussion here as well. We've got the four speakers. Once they've finished, we're going to open up to questions and answers, both live here in Oxford and through Zoom. So feel free, those of you who are joining us on Zoom, do put your questions up there. Put them up as we go along, and we'll start accessing them. And then we've got about 30 minutes at the end. It's a 90-minute piece we've got here. We've got about 30 minutes at the end in which we can explore those questions. And we're really keen to have a discussion with everybody in the room. So thanks for joining today. And let's go straight on to our first speaker then, Aline Soterroni, who's a fellow in NBS at the Oxford Net Zero and Nature-Based Solutions Initiatives. Welcome, Aline.
Thank you, James, for this great introduction and overview. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. And I'd also like to thank the speakers for being with us today. And I'm going to share some preliminary results on a quantitative assessment analysis on the UDR in Brazil. This piece of work I've been leading in collaboration with several colleagues, many of them in this webinar, in this room. But more important than sharing these results is to promote a debate on this policy, the UDR, that is in the intersection of two intertwined crises of climate and biodiversity. But let me start sharing some background information about Brazil. In Brazil, Amazon and Cerrado are the largest biomes with the highest deforestation rates. 20% of the Brazilian Amazon has been deforested. The whole Amazon basin is close to achieving a tipping point. Everybody knows that. But what I would like to highlight here is that Cerrado is disappearing faster than the Amazon. And what are the main drivers of this deforestation? Agriculture is the main direct and indirect driver of deforestation in Brazil. As James has explained, beef and soy, they are the commodities with the high exposure to deforestation. And Brazil is a major global producer and exporter of soy and beef. Beef is mainly for domestic consumption, and soy is mainly for exports. And although the majority of Brazilian agricultural outputs is free from deforestation, still agriculture is the main driver of native vegetation loss in Brazil. So then it's worth mentioning that the future of Brazilian agriculture also depends on the ecosystem's protections, because it really depends on the equilibrium of ecosystems and water regulation, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, pollination, in other words, depends on nature. And to curb deforestation, we have an important piece of legislation, a legal instrument, which is the Forest Code. James already touched this law. Fabiola, for sure, is going to talk more about national initiatives. And I'd like to highlight here 2 points. So first, the Forest Code allows some extent of deforestation, which is called legal deforestation. And the second point is that the Forest Code has never been fully enforced. On the other hand, we have instruments to curb deforestation that are voluntary zero deforestation commitments, more recently net zero pledges. and Rachel will talk more about voluntary initiatives. And what I'd like to highlight here is that despite the amount of zero deforestation commitments out there, deforestation continues at alarming rates. And the UDR, EU Deforestation Regulation, is an important example of a new wave of legislations, unilateral regulations that are based on due diligence and aims to govern the supply chains from the demand side. As James has already explained the UDR, I just want to highlight here 2 points. So first, the most important commodities for the Brazilian case, soy and cattle, and second, the definition of forest. So the law that was approved takes into account forest according to the FAO definition. So here in these maps, just to make the definition clearer, we have Brazil's native vegetation in the year 2020 reclassified according to those definitions. So we have forest FAO and other wooded land FAO. And as you can see, it's pretty clear in those maps, the law that was approved doesn't cover important non-forest ecosystems like Cerrado in Brazil. And if it adopts the other wooded land, it would improve Cerrado coverage. And the questions I would like to touch here in this presentation are basically these 3 questions. So how much deforestation could this regulation potentially avoid in Brazil? The importance of adding other wooded land, and what would happen if other major consumer markets like China follow a similar legislation. And to help answer these questions, we are using a regional version of a global economic partial equilibrium land use model, Global in Brazil. This model simulates the competition for land among the main sectors of the land use economy. 30 different regions represented in this model are interconnected through trade, and it means that the demand for meat in China will drive soybean production in Brazil because Brazil exports soy to feed animals in China. I've been leading the work on Global in Brazil for quite some time, and this model captures Brazil's specificities, national policies. It's validated for the historical period, which gives confidence in future projections, and more details you can find in these publications at the bottom, but you can also always contact me. With models, mathematical models, what do? We create scenarios. So in scenarios modeling, we usually have a baseline scenario, and in our study, the baseline captures a weak environmental governance. And basically, in this scenario, there is no restriction on the conversion from native vegetation to soy, pasture, and other uses. And then we are looking at deforestation control scenarios. So in our UDR scenario, the areas classified as forest according to FAO, these are the areas that cannot be converted to soy and pasture. In our EUDR with other wooded land scenario, the areas classified as forest and other wooded land, these are the areas that cannot be converted to soy and pasture. And since we are talking about deforestation control in Brazil, it's important to have a scenario that takes into account the implementation of the forest code where illegal deforestation is prevented. So then we take the model outputs and combine with market share from traceability, transparency data. And just to have an idea, here we have at the bottom, the market shares for soy in China and the market share for soy that goes to the EU. So we combine these 2 information, and then I'm going to share all the preliminary results. I just want to make a disclaimer. These are very preliminary results of a research that is going on. And I will focus on the deforestation, but also emissions are possible to estimate, and also the risk, deforestation risk per company. But here I'm going to focus on the deforestation risk per destination. But let's first look at the future deforestation in Brazil. According to our forest code, our baseline scenario, the future deforestation in Brazil is likely to be 64 million hectares. Just to give an idea, this is comparable to the size of 3 UKs in the next 30 years. And the majority of this deforestation will likely to be driven by beef. And when we look at beef, the majority of deforestation for beef will be connected to domestic consumption. And given the small market share of the EU, for beef, we will focus now onwards on soy. And our model is projecting 5 million hectares of deforestation for soy in the future in Brazil. The majority of this deforestation will be for the exports, mainly China and the EU. And if we consider this solid blue bar, the total deforestation for soy in Brazil, the light blue bar represents the deforestation that is connected to the EU consumption. So the EUDR, EU Deforestation Regulation, aims to decrease this amount of deforestation. But the law that was approved, how much deforestation this law could prevent? According to our scenarios, this is the amount that this regulation can prevent. It's only 10% of the deforestation connected to the EU consumption in Brazil, or less than 3% of the total deforestation for soy projected by our scenarios in Brazil. And what would happen if the EUDR adds other wooded land? It will improve the impact of this legislation, and this represents an almost 7-fold increase. And we did the similar analysis for China, and again, if China follows the EUDR, it's important to have other wooded land. But if China is going to follow it or not, this is something that André is going to touch in his presentation. But there is an understanding that if China is to implement due diligence, it will be more connected to national legislations, so more a forest code-like approach, where only illegal deforestation will be touched. And in this case, it's also important to notice that it will decrease the potential of a scenario where the China follows the EUDR with other wooded land. So then if we have China and the EU following the EUDR with other wooded land, these two destinations, these two major consumer markets, they could prevent almost half of future deforestation for soy, but it's 2.3 million hectares. And remember, the total amount of deforestation projected for the next 30 years is 64 million hectares. And the EUDR, it's a regulation that becomes more relevant given the fact that, according to our scenarios, the 2/3 of the future deforestation for soy in the Cerrado biome will be legal according to the forest code. It means that if the forest code is fully enforced, which is a huge challenge, 2/3 of the deforestation for soy are not going to be prevented by this national legislation. So then we would need additional legislations, initiatives to protect this important region, especially because the deforestation that's projected to happen in the future, it will be mainly located in Mato Piba, which is where the last undisturbed remnants of Cerrado are located. In summary, my 4 main takeaway messages are this one. So first, the importance of incorporating other wooded land. It's a consensus in academia, civil society, that other wooded land should be incorporated in the legislation. But we are, as far as I know, the first to estimate, quantify the impact of adding the other wooded land, and it would more than sevenfold or almost more than sixfold and almost sevenfold the impact. Second, it's important to have other consumer markets, especially China, to avoid leakage. Third, the UDR with other wooded land would help to protect Brazil Cerrado, especially because Cerrado, the forest code would not be enough to protect this hotspot of biodiversity that's disappearing at alarming rates. And finally, although in absolute numbers, the UDR would avoid a small fraction of the total deforestation that will be mainly for beef and for domestic consumption. This legislation, this regulation could have a positive chain reaction in order to have the enforcement of other initiatives like the Forest Code in Brazil, and it can also be important to push other major consumer markets to follow a similar regulation. Thank you, obrigada, and over to you, James.
Great, thanks, Aline. Thanks so much. Let's move straight on to Fabiola Zerbini. Fabiola is Director of the Department of Forests at the Ministry of the Environment in Brazil. Fabiola, can you hear us okay?
Yes, and you?
Great, yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to take off the slide share. Just to say a very warm welcome, Fabiola. Thank you for joining us today. I know you're only with us for the first hour, so if we have any questions, we'll get them through to you during that hour. We've obviously heard from Aline how important the Forest Code is as part of the solution on zero deforestation and net zero. So over to you from a Brazilian government perspective on both of those points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks a lot for the Oxford University, for the invitation. Thanks, James, Aline. Thanks for the great presentation. It's always good to learn and to keep listening and to keep talking and reflecting with the global community about the problems and the solutions that we are all committed as a one word, but also as a new moment for the Brazilian government. Well, I will start saying that I will not bring an official or a unique positioning from the Brazilian government in relation with the regulation or the EU regulation, but I will bring many aspects and topics and plans and actions and results that are connected with the main purpose of the regulation, but also the main purpose, I think, that all of us are committed, and it's related with the title, also the net zero title of our conversation today. How to really bring and align in a harmonized, but also in a strategic relationship between agriculture, forest, and climate. And this is for sure not only impact the Brazilian context or the Brazilian hydric security or the Brazilian climate security, or even more the Brazilian food security, but as all of us kind of knows, but as we will also see in some of the presentations today and other webinars, I'm sure of that, is that it's the impact, it's also connected with the whole world. So this is why it's so important we talk and work together for the purpose and bring all the tools and try to organize the tools, the legislations, the incentives, and the efforts from different players and perspectives, in favor of the same goal or toward the same goal, to really have a different way to deal with land use where agriculture and forests are well combined, impacting in a good way in all of these topics that I brought before. So I am speaking on behalf of the Forest Department, which is placed in a National Secretariat of Biodiversity Forest, and which is placed in the Environmental Ministry of Brazil. And I'm sure to glad the 5 main objectives that we are all committed as environmental ministry, but also as part of a broader agenda, an environmental agenda in the Brazilian government. No? And from these objectives, I will talk a little bit about the main commitments that we reassumed. Some of them are already global commitments, already assumed in conventions like the climate one or the biodiversity one, but others are national or new ones. And how we are dealing as environmental ministry to really accomplish or implement or really accomplish, this is the best word in English, with this commitment, which is the prevention of deforestation plan, which is the PPCDs. I will explain a little bit more about that, but also the implementation forest code by the implementation of the Plana VEG, which is another plan, the recovery or the restoration plan of the Brazilian government. Well, back into the beginning. So the 5 objectives that the environmental ministry is committed is first, really deal with the climate emergency. This is crucial. And this is why also we are now named it as environmental ministry and climate change, as all of you should know. The second one is the bioeconomy, and bioeconomy also includes a new perspective for the forest as a key axis, as a key pillar of the economic development model of Brazil. So how to really bring forest as an asset, not only by doing or using, like the extractivisms or what the richness that the forest can bring to us, like fruits and food and cosmetics and whatever, but also by recovering and also by creating a new way to deal with other important economic sectors as the agriculture one. The third is the recovery, the restoration, connected to the conservation of biodiversity, and also forest zero deforestation or forest deforestation combat plans. The fourth one is the environmental quality in the cities and how to really better connect cities, forests, and the rural area of our country. And the fifth is the hydric resources, so how to really improve the whole, not only the quality, but also and the way that we deal with the hydric security in our country and from the country, as I mentioned in the beginning, to the world. So some of the commitments that are connected with these 5 main objectives are zero deforestation, and I will explain what means zero deforestation for the Brazilian government. Reforestation of 12 million hectares by 2030. 30% of the areas in the Brazilian biomes or the native vegetation protected. 30% of the degraded land areas recovered by 2030. These both are very connected with the Biodiversity Convention that was held in Montreal last year. 30% of the land waters and coastal areas effectively conserved and well managed. And these are some new ones. We will create new 6 million hectares of protected areas. And this is even goes beyond the legal or the illegal deforestation discussions. No, this brings other levels of protection that are very important for the biodiversity and also all ecological equilibrium of the whole all biomes in Brazil. Yesterday we announced it too, and by the way, and also another one that is very connected with this topic in a broader perspective, as I mentioned in the beginning. Like we will allocate 57 million hectares of non-designated public land in the Amazon. This is very important because this is also will bring a very different perspective for the land use in Brazil in the whole country. We have other commitments and connected with the carbon market, connected with environmental services, cities, whatever, but I just try to bring the ones that are most connected with the topic that we are talking here. Well, so how the environmental ministry are looking, and there are many other actions being done, but I will highlight the 2 that I mentioned in the beginning, like the PPCDs, which is the combat deforestation plans. The PPCD is the one that you may know a little bit more or have listened about, which is the PPCD, combat deforestation in the Amazon. This is why it's PPCD. But we will have also the PPCD Cerrado and all the other biomes, Pampas, Mata Atlantic Forest, and all the others. The PPCD, which was the first one, was launched in the beginning of the year, and I think was the main real concrete action, you know, and the good news is that it's already resulting. You know, we have, and yesterday also was announced, you know, a reduction of 66% of deforestation. If you compare the month of August of this year in relation with the last year, and we had also in the whole, you know, like 42% from January to July. The August number is still not summarized or included in this one, but we are sure looking to the 66% that it will also increase. The 42% will potentially increase in terms of how we are working to really reduce deforestation in the Amazon. So PPCD is already resulting, no, which is a good news, and it's important to say. And this is also for sure connected, because the PPCD it's not only a command and control plan. It's a plan that also combines different perspectives that are connected with the objectives and the commitments that I mentioned here already, but not only command and control, but also how to bring a sustainable productive activities for the forest and for the Amazon, planning land and territorial. And by doing this, really intelligence, territorial intelligence, making better choices, you know, together with the governments, the subnational ones, and etc., and how to incentivize economically, but also from a regulatory perspective. You know, this, I think, the combination of this access are the results, or are why we are having such good results. But we know that some of this access depends or are more medium or long term, you know, and we really hope to have more than 42% or whatever, but to really achieve the zero deforestation by 2030. And this is important to say what means zero deforestation. For the PPCD and the PPCDs in general, no, forest zero deforestation means the legal deforestation, as Aline just brought in the beginning. So the portion that is allowed to be, the portion that we are committed, or that all private properties are committed to really conserve inside their own properties, you know. But also there are the portion that are compensated from the legal suppression of vegetation. So the numbers are not so objective, like just looking to the 80%, 20% are a little bit different, no? And also because there are many legal compensations that are included as kind of mandatory, you know, from license process, or even from process where a company or a person, an individual person, commits makes something wrong, no, against the law. But in any way, this is what we are considering zero deforestation by 2030. But we know that if we look to the Cerrado, so the Amazon was launched, public consultation, it is still being reviewed, and the results are there. The Cerrado is a different situation. The Cerrado was like the next one in the calendar. So it will be launched next week, in the 13th of September, the first version of the PPCD Cerrado, and it will be also included in a public consultations, and all of you will be able to know the document. It will be in Portuguese, but all of you will be able to see the document and to make your comments, you know, to really improve this. And the PPCD Cerrado is exactly where the topic that we are talking here are more like connected, or are more important to be understood. And why I'm saying that is because in the Amazon, the illegal deforestation is the main driver, is how the deforestation is pretty much more working or impacting, you know. And when you look to the national perspective, you need to look to the main, or to the majority, not to the details, you know. So really combat illegal deforestation is a way to save the Amazon. And we are showing how to do this by numbers, by results. But in the Cerrado, this is not the case. You know, as Aline just said, and we all agree with you, Aline, there are a really complex now interrelation and clear interrelation between agriculture, legal deforestation, and conversion or deforestation in the whole Cerrado. And the impacts are huge. Also, the impacts for the agriculture. So the hydric security is very, very compromised. Also, the biodiversity conservation and also the local social development and just social justice in the whole biome. And this is very important to say. And so deal with a better relation between agriculture, forest, land use, and by doing this, really bringing a different scenario for the Cerrado, a different one that you brought, Aline. This is the main objective, that we are committed in the PPCD Cerrado, and we really hope to count with your comments and your contributions as a global community as well, to really improve it in a way that it will really achieve the point. And if you look again, that the command and control, and it's not the only access of the PPCDs, we will understand that also other instruments and tools are being thinked from a governmental and from a Brazilian perspective to really incentivize the producers and create a different way where deforestation or the cost of opportunity of the land will be shifted to something different. So where conservation, where restoration are more interesting, also in a profitability perspective, a financial perspective, to the producers. So I think the whole idea about the incentives and the whole idea about how to really combine other tools to the implementation of the forest code is being also broadened, and we really want again to see how it will be implemented. And we know that this needs to deliver fast, because the numbers of deforestation in the Cerrado are increasing. So we really I hope to back soon in other webinars, bringing the same results as we have for the Amazon by really having a good implementation on the Cerrado plan. But I will bring a third element that is, and the one that I'm really leading as a forest department here in the environmental ministry, which is the Planaveg. And why I'm bringing this, Planaveg is the national public policy on restoration. We call like nature vegetation recovery, because it's connected with all biomes. And the Planaveg is the plan by the government, the Brazilian government designed it, with the civil society and the private sector, etc., but designed it to really accomplish with the 12 million hectares of restoration. And we cannot implement the 12 million hectares of restoration without really implement the Brazilian Forest Code. But beyond that, really in recovering all the degraded areas that are inside the conservation units of Brazil, in the indigenous territories of Brazil, or even in the rural properties, like the private properties that are degradation. It's not interesting for anybody. For the agri sector, it's not interesting for anybody, so. Forest code implementation, also degradation recovery. And for sure, by doing this, the Brazilian NDC, which is connected with the climate, and also many other impacts, biodiversity conservation, etc., hydric security, etc., will be accomplished if we really go ahead with the Planaveg. And the Planaveg is now being resumed. We have good news. The public-private governance is already will have your first meeting in the end of October. We have a huge collective efforts from the Brazilian government to really go into this data. And the Planaveg, by really looking to the implementation of the forest code, is the locus from where the environmental ministry is working very close with the agriculture ministry to understand how, by implementing the forest code, we really can bring a connected vision for in a landscape perspective for the whole rural property. Really combine regenerative agriculture, environmental regularization, and in a context of like we call it functional property. So that look into the whole property is the key, I think, point that we really want to bring to make the shifting process of a way make agriculture in Brazil to a different way. And we are planning and working with the agriculture ministry in many of demonstrative unities in the Cerrado specifically, to really showcase and to really prove the concept that a new way to produce is possible. And by doing this, we will also make a big movement in terms and in connection with other macroeconomic public policies to guarantee the incentives and to guarantee that the new positive cycle will be understood as the status quo, or as the one that is the only one. So back into to the beginning of the point, there are many actions. I just brought a small picture of them that are being implemented now by the Brazilian government to guarantee that the concept of the EU regulation will be structured, will be built, will be really well implemented in the near future, but not only by accomplish, and this is not only in relation with accomplished or not accomplished with trade obligation. So if we look as a country to this global movement, and we are looking, and use this global movement and to really improve the environmental, the agriculture, and the whole economic development model of Brazil based on the sustainability pillars and impacts, I think that all of us will win. So this is the message that I want to bring. Sorry for not being in the time, and thanks for the opportunity again.
Fabiola, thanks so much. Really appreciate your words here, and just bringing up the presentation again. EU regulation important, Brazil-based national legislation important as well, and now we're going to hear more about China. So delighted to welcome Andre Vasconcelos, who's the Global Engagement Lead at Trace. Welcome, Andre.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Aline, James, and all the speakers. It's a pleasure to be here. So I want to talk a little bit about in the context of the EUDR, what's the role of other consumer markets or the cooperation in general. And I want to bring four main messages here that I think would be my main takeaways here. But before I jump into the message or the key messages, I just wanted to set a little bit of a context in terms of when we look from the demand side or from the EU side in terms of imports, what are the tropical deforestation associated with the EU imports. And when we look at the data, and this is a study published by, or data published by Florence Pendrew, we saw that a lot of what the deforestation exposure, the deforestation risk associated with the EU imports is coming from a handful of commodities, really. So we see palm oil, soybeans, wood products, coffee, but coming from different countries, Indonesia, Brazil, Paraguay, Chile, Honduras. So the EUDR will indeed affect the land use in many different countries. And putting a bit in the context of the size of the EU markets, in the case here for soybeans, in the beginning, the EU had a really good representation of the market, but this is massively changed over time, and we see players like now China really dominating the whole markets. And this sort of leads me to the first point. So the EUDR by itself cannot solve the problem of deforestation associated with supply chains. I mean, it's an extremely complex problem that has, to be addressed in a systematic way with all the players, the actors in the different supply chains involved to address this problem. And I think what Aline presented set the stage quite nicely, that we really need this cooperation. Talking a little bit about the challenges and opportunities, I mean, the EUDR, as James said in the beginning, is really unprecedented. It's really, a really breakthrough regulation. So, the EU is stepping a little bit ahead and taking actually a lot of risks, because it will impact commodities price, it will impact, their consumption, food security, and all of that. So there is a lot of questions that we need to answer, but it's definitely, a good step in the right direction. But we are aware of this leakage risk, right? So in face of these new trade barriers or these new environmental criteria, a lot of countries, partners may just redirect their exports to other markets, especially China as one of the major markets for agricultural commodities. And actually, we saw that in the case of the EUTR, the EU timber regulation. So I remember back in the days in Brazil when I was working for the pulp and paper sector, I heard so many times companies saying, well, if we don't get certified by FSC and we cannot export to the EU, we will simply export it and send it to China or to other markets. So this is a really, important risk we need to take into account. And then in the worst case scenario, what can happen, actually, the imports for the EU can be deforestation free, but the deforestation will continue. So that's why we need to address this from many different angles. And this brings me to the second point. We need China on the table. We really need to bring China to the discussion and see, and I think we need to understand what's the scenario there, what are the opportunities for China to step in. And so last year, I did a piece of research looking at the prospects of the EU and China cooperation, specifically on the deforestation associated with supply chains. And I had the opportunity to interview policymakers and stakeholders, both in the EU side and in the China side. And the cooperation is moving ahead. But one thing that came out quite clearly is that during the development of the EU regulation, I mean, the European Commission was definitely aware of the risk of the leakage and the limitations of the impact because of the size of the market. So they strategically designed the EUDR with a few mechanisms to influence and support other consumer markets to take a similar approach. And this is something that came out from these interviews. And they wanted to influence and support other consumer markets, including China, via three main mechanisms. One of them is by asking full traceability of the companies trading to the EU. So once the companies start implementing this full traceability, then it will lower the barrier for China to ask for similar standards. And once we have traceability information, once you know where your commodity is coming from, you can much better manage risks in terms of supply, in terms of food risks, food security, in terms of price, and so on. The second mechanism is, so the EUDR has a system what's called the benchmark system, in which they will classify all the countries in categories of risk, high or low or negligible risks. And this provides an opportunity for the EU, once this is implemented, for the EU align with China via their dialogues, their official dialogues, to try to see how these standards can actually be aligned. And the third point, or the third mechanism, is that the EU will gather a lot of data, a lot of information via traceability, via transparency, and this knowledge can be useful for exchange with China to this technical exchange to really bring information and data for China. But one thing that came out really clear from the research is China will not implement trade measures based on deforestation free in the same way as the EUDR, at least in the foreseeable future. And this is because of many reasons that stakeholders shared. But one point that came out quite strongly is that China does not want it sees these regulations that will influence the other countries rights to explore their land use as sort of a potential interference in their sovereignty. So China has this strong political principle of non-intervention, as was mentioned. But other aspects include commodity price and obviously food security. So China now has a limited arable land to expand their commodities production. So they really depend on imports. And there's a big risk for them, or a big concern, that any actions that will impose trade barriers can actually have implications for their food security. So in summary, the perceived risks of adopting any stringent measures, regulations, actions currently, in that perspective, outweigh the potential benefits. So then China is much more inclined to implement anything more related to legality, which would be aligned with, the country's own national regulation. And this is something interesting for us to explore and to discuss more. I hope we can discuss this more here and in other spaces as well. What would be the scenario, or what would be the implications in a scenario where we have the UDR, deforestation free, and also China with any legality-based measures? How would that impact? And I think Aline's study will bring a lot of information on that. And the fourth point, which I think it's not necessarily connected to China, but I think it's quite often fall under the radar, is actually that the UDR require products to be deforestation free. That's the Article 3A, but also produced in compliance with national regulations. And this is a key part of the UDR that we often forget. And we are currently doing a study, and we will be published a big assessment together, so TRACE leading together with Brazilian organizations Imaflora and ICV, looking at all the soy production in the Amazon and in the Cerrado to see to what extent is in compliance with key elements of the forest code. And what we see actually is that in the case of the UDR, in the case of the soy, the Brazilian soy, there is a higher risk of non-compliance with the UDR with the Article 3B, with compliance with the national regulation, than with the deforestation free. So the legality requirement definitely needs more attention than it has received so far. And I think an important point of that is that the UDR can support Brazil in the journey of implementing the forest codes. The forest code is there. It has it's a brilliant law. It has many mechanisms to regulate land use, but also to integrate farmers that are not in compliance. So the EU doesn't have to come up with new mechanisms, but rather it's an opportunity during the implementation of the UDR for the EU to support these already mechanisms there in Brazil. And just finally, I think it's important to mention that zero deforestation approach and the focus on legality, they are not mutually exclusive, but they are actually look at completely different things, and they are actually much more complementary than we believe. So those are the points that I wanted to bring here around the UDR. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andre. Rachel, you're dialing in from Cambridge. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to come off the screen here. Rachel Garrett does a lot of work on environmental legislation, looking at issues around equity and effectiveness of that legislation. Welcome, Rachel. Thanks. And I know that one of the things you're looking at is, is this enough? Is this EUDR enough in the way that it's been formulated as well? But would welcome your thoughts for the next 7 to 10 minutes, and then we'll go to questions.
Great, thanks. And I will try to be on the 7-minute side, but please don't hesitate to monitor me if there's any issues with that. So I wanted to try to make 2 main points, picking up on the themes by Fabiola and Andre and James and Aline actually as well. So first, I want to pick up on this considerable uncertainty about what will happen as a result of the regulation, because there's just a lot of the details that haven't actually been finalized. There's a lot of concepts that you've heard a little bit about now, risk benchmarking and compliance with legality, but as well as zero deforestation, inclusion of other woodlands. Like there's lots of things that are words that you may be hearing for the first time, but they're actually like very, very complicated to actually implement. And there's a lot of scale issues and monitoring issues. And anyway, so this is the first point about uncertainty that I'll dig into a little bit more. And just one specific point is that the really cool cutting edge analysis that Aline pointed out, and it's a little bit depressing because it's focused on soy, but and so it highlights the kind of overall very limited amount of avoided deforestation that could be expected compared to the size of the problem. She ended by saying something like 2 million hectares compared to 64 million hectares that's projected. But even this is, in some ways, we've discussed this, Aline and I, like this is a best case scenario. So, it's highlighting this is the limited amount we can expect in a best case scenario just for the soy part. And the reason for all of that is that like there's just that's if we assume that when you make a rule in a place it's actually followed and not taking into account loopholes and leakage that people have been bringing up. And so I'll go into that. And just to say, like, we have no idea for cattle because we've been studying cattle, myself and many other researchers and Trace and, for a long time. And we still have many questions, even in terms of why supply chain policies focused on cattle that are done by companies are not being 100% effective, and how to fix that problem. So there's a considerable amount of uncertainty. And so the second point I want to make is, and so that uncertainty can go two ways. It can be, this is a best case scenario and probably the effects will be more limited, or maybe there will be some structural transformations that we don't expect yet, and those could be very good. The second point I'm going to make after that in my few minutes is that we need to think a bit more about how the EUDR sits within the broader arc of conservation and development in the tropics. And here's where I'm actually much more optimistic. And I think it's important for us to take a moment and sit back and think of the normative implications of the policy. So just to dig into a little bit of detail about the uncertainty, some of the questions that we just still have, and I'm just leaving them as questions, are, at what scale will the risk benchmarking be carried out? Is it going to go ahead at the national level, which is crazy for a country as big as Brazil or Indonesia? Or is it going to devolve to state levels or some other scale or biomes or whatever it is? We argue in many of our statements about this that more localized towards state level is better because it can actually, crowd in incentives for good governance at the state level to kind of develop a really deforestation-free profile as an entity, whereas you have kind of less efficacy and less capacity to make a difference at the national level if you're any one state. What input will countries have and states have in this process of how the benchmarking is carried out? Then we have this concept of traceability, and really this is a critical part of the legislation that is actually triggering a lot of business reaction, is this need to trace to individual farms, and how costly and reliable is this full traceability going to be? Who's going to win and who's going to lose from those efforts? How will this new information be used and by whom? I was just talking about this in the case of cocoa yesterday. And, it's actually less radical in the context of Brazil to be tracing individual properties, because this has already happened through the Cadastro Ambiental Rural, and a lot of that gets made, almost public, this information. But in a not so good governance scenario, and when more people have access to information, what happens to the people who are being now completely visible to everybody about what they're doing on their property? Then there's this big leakage question, and let me just formulate it this way. Will companies bother trying to meet the standards in high and medium risk areas to still export to the EU, or will they just start sourcing from other regions and leave high risk regions to domestic markets? or to China. And this has come up through a couple of the talks. The domestic market is huge for deforestation products globally. It's over 90% in Africa, and it's over 60% in all of Latin America. It's just that for soy, this profile is pretty good because a lot of it is going to exports. But like, so we've talked about China and their importance for soy, but the domestic market is really important too. So will we just see a big shuffling around? And if that's the case, then this is a policy that just helps keep deforestation products out of the EU. It doesn't actually do anything for deforestation. And will companies, if they do stay in a region, will they focus on larger farmers only? Will they start to vertically integrate more? What are the ways they're going to find to minimize costs? We've actually already observed things like this in response to the voluntary environmental supply chain policies. So I think we can expect more of the same with the EUDR. And on the last 2 points, I really see that the potential in Brazil, in particular, for some of the perverse consequences to occur, because you actually do have medium and large-sized farmers. You do have heterogeneity across regions and across farmers for soy and beef, but especially for beef. And so if you have the heterogeneity, there's greater risk that you just shift towards the already good producers and leave the problem aside. Okay, so that's all pretty negative and a lot of question marks. But the positive side, with my last 2 minutes, I just want to say that I'm more optimistic about the implications of this overall process of switching from what's called soft law, where we encourage companies to use voluntary standards, and we track through transparency initiatives, we track how they're doing on adopting these voluntary initiatives, to hard law, where we actually require them to do things and produce a due diligence statement. And here I'm drawing on some recent paper by Leila Burning and Metodi Soterroni at Freiburg, who make some two excellent points, that the EU can be seen as the EUDR can be seen as an acknowledgement of the accountability failures that resulted from these relying on soft instruments, voluntary agreements, etc., and the long experience with the EU timber legality rules. And so we know that we need something harder. And that, I think, the biggest point about that is that it hardens corporate accountability for negative socio-environmental externalities. And put another way, normatively speaking, like, it's saying that companies actually have more responsibility for these negative effects, that they can't just get away with doing whatever they want for profit motivations, and that they are going to be held accountable if they want to do business in Europe. And I think that is probably the most important and transformative point. And because this is going to come to some cost to EU consumers and the EU livestock industry, although surely it'll benefit other EU producers, it is in a way an acknowledgement of the responsibility of consumers in the global north for these problems. So those, I think, are really important. And it's also very critical what Andre points out about the requirement for legal compliance as having, even from a technical perspective that he points out, having more of a potential effect in places, in certain places. And I think that overall, again, this overall concept that you actually have to care about deforestation in new places where nobody was paying attention to them before. If you have some laws on the books about what's legal and illegal, being able to prove that you're legal is a non-negligible aspect of all of this. And then finally, I just want to share some concerns about the normative implications. And the big point I wanted to make here is that while there's all this good stuff happening in terms of taking responsibility and accountability, it's also unfortunate that it's all negative incentives. So it's basically a penalty. You can't sell to us if you do bad things. And it's not bringing the positive incentives in terms of finance or the capacity building in terms of new economic models that is really needed for the scope of this problem. And that's unfortunate because in the early conversations, they actually said this would be part of a smart mix that had all those components, but the smart mix didn't come along yet. And, we don't have the positive incentives or the negative. We don't have the subsidies, the finance, at the level that's needed for the problem. And this is linked to the point that Fabiola brought up about the socio-bioeconomy, which is part of the government plans in Brazil. This idea that she briefly touched on is that you need an alternative because everything's been going in a certain direction for 50 years. And trying to fight against that tide is costly. And this is more along the same lines of trying to fight against the tide, just trying to avoid deforestation. But what are we building instead? And I would really like to see more from the EU and other countries in the global north to actually bring along and help support where are we going in terms of building economies that actually take advantage of the assets, the cultural and biodiversity assets. So that's all I'm going to say, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm going to invite Aline and Andre to come and sit up with me here. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. We've got some questions online as well. We'll take maybe a couple in the room and a couple online as well. And keen to engage with you guys here. I think just on your final point or your penultimate point there, Rachel, that the EU legislation and what's coming out of Brazil are changing radically the way companies are operating. And I think myself and Andre work very closely with the traders, for example. And one key change that's happened there is it used to be the sustainability departments that were dealing with this kind of thing. Now their legal departments are on board. And that companies are taking things seriously when their legal departments come on board. So we're really seeing kind of change in the day-to-day of the way companies are operating and taking seriously deforestation in places like Brazil. Do we have any questions from the room before we take maybe a couple online? Feel free to raise your hand and introduce yourself, please. Yeah, right at the back there, please.
Is that on? Yeah, there we go. Thank you. It's been an absolutely fascinating session. My name's George Middleton. I'm an international trade consultant, but more relevantly for this afternoon, an associate program director at Wilton Park. Wilton Park's an executive agency of the UK's Foreign Office. It's triggered a lot of thinking, but basically Wilton Park hosts, facilitates conversations around complex global issues. And it's to the point around cooperation, a lot of references to China, obviously the European Union. I'm interested to know where the UK is in amongst this as well. But the other kind of two areas or kind of stakeholder groups which jump out, one is the WTO, and the other would be the private sector. And I guess my open question would be, where is that conversation happening at the moment, whereby you've got those different authorities, both national but also the EU? Where's that coming together with multilateral organisations and the private sector, and is that happening effectively?
Great, super question. You see you can hear me on the microphone. Let's take a couple in the room. I'm gonna share a couple online. So let's take these three, 1, 2, 3, lady in the pink, and then gentleman on the left here. I'll take two online, and then we'll go through you guys, and I'll try and allocate them as effectively as possible.
My name is Divya. I'm a postdoc at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group. And my question pertains to the likes of JBS, Minerva, and Marfrig, who are the biggest meat packers in the world. And they wield a lot of control over how things are done in the sector. And do you think, how is the EU, how is their power going to influence, their consolidation going to influence the implementation of EUDR?
Great question. Thank you so much. And the third one here, and then I'll just share a couple online.
Hi, Steve Smith from here at Oxford Net Zero. Thank you from me too for all the speakers, really fascinating. And I was really struck by just how big the impact is from domestic beef consumption. We're seeing in parts of Europe and elsewhere actually quite big transitions in dietary preferences. And I was just wondering, what are the kind of assumptions about domestic meat consumption baked into these scenarios, and where are the uncertainties? Where is the sort of cultural conversation in Brazil about eating beef at the moment?
That's a really lovely and thorny issue. So let's try and just organize this. And there's I'm going to share the questions online. So Aline, I think maybe you can add to this point, this last point around domestic consumption and what's going on around that. But there's also a question online around. So Isabella Bayalaska has asked what measures can be undertaken to ensure that the EUDR does not result in diverting trade away from the EU and towards higher risk markets, and how can producers be supported? So that's a sort of Brazil piece. There's a question for Fabiola. I'm afraid Fabiola's had to leave, but Rachel, maybe this is one that sort of touches on the point that you raise as well about positive incentives. And just getting to the end of the question, what could improve collaboration in diplomacy and trade between Brazil in the EU and the EU on solutions to deforestation and conversion? So, Rachel, perhaps you can take that in light of what you said about optimism, and if you've got thoughts as well on the question that was raised by the colleague at Wilton Park around the role that can be played by the private sector and WTO, I think that would be super. And then, Andre, there's another question online around the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, how that comes into play, and then perhaps you can take the question about the meat packers, because you often have some quite feisty calls with the meat packers, I know. So welcome your thoughts on that. Aline, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Starting with the consumption of beef, our scenarios are using a business as usual hypothesis for the consumption. So we keep the historical trends in the future, but it can be changed with a scenario modeling tool. But if we decrease beef consumption in Brazil, it will still be high. And if it doesn't happen in the rest of the world, Brazil would end up exporting more beef. So then we need like this movement everywhere. So not only within Brazil, but also outside Brazil. But it's still the size of the herd is larger than the Brazilian population. So it's a very conservative assumption, but it's good to prioritize actions. And for the beef, which is a big problem in the Amazon, we need national policies, but we also need the interaction with other initiatives like the UDR. And then connecting to the Isabella question on diverting trade, this question is about leakage. And leakage is really significant, can be really significant. And that's why we need other major consumer markets like China following this legislation. But another type of leakage that could happen in Brazil is redirection of traders' operations. So the handful of traders for soy and beef, they are operating all over Brazil, but they can start sourcing soy from consolidated areas to the EU market and keep sourcing soy and beef contaminated with deforestation from the high risk areas. And how to prevent that? One way would be having a benchmark system to classify traders instead of regions or in combination with regions. Because if companies like JBS, Marfrig, Minerva, and other 7 companies for soy, 10 companies controlling 70% of this market, they have this benchmark system, then it will push them to clean their entire supply chains and not only the bilateral flow with Europe.
Thanks, Aline. Rachel, just a reminder, perhaps you could give us views on opportunities to improve collaboration in diplomacy between Brazil and the EU in the light of what you said about opportunities. And if you have any thoughts on the point about involving WTO, the private sector in dialogue as well, please.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it simple, but basically I think the fundamental problem here is like environment and development are separate, always. So, you know, you have everywhere a Ministry of Environment and everywhere a Ministry of International Development. And the two things are not working towards the same goals. And we say this all the time, deforestation in Brazil has not brought inclusive development. And without inclusive development, you can't stop deforestation. So we're just going to keep spending tons of money on trying to avoid deforestation. We're not going to solve deforestation, and we're not going to bring well-being. So I think the biggest thing is bringing those efforts together on the side in the global north, in the EU, in the UK, and other places, and to try to see that as a combined strategy that has to be undertaken, where you're actually investing in development opportunities. I have seen really good work, actually, like in Germany, where they really invest a huge amount of effort in things like land tenure programs in the places that they're sourcing from. And so I think that's the direction that we need to be moving towards. And Brazil has made this change, in my opinion. I think that they've seen this. There's been programs combining conditional cash transfers and environmental outcomes. And now the socio-bioeconomy is part of the PPC down plan that Fabiola talked about. And so, yeah, I think that was the question. Did I miss any parts of it?
That's super. Thanks, Rachel. Andre, the Mercosur trade deal, how does that come into play? And what's the role of the meat packers? And given the power, the economic power that they have, to what degree is the EU DR going to move the dial?
I think, can you hear me well? Yeah. So, I mean, answering your question in a very simplistic way, of course, is much more complex, and because these meat packers do have a lot of power, indeed. But in the context of the UDR, they don't have much leverage to change anything, because we are talking about that around 80% of the production stays in the domestic market. Most of the exports goes to China and Middle East countries. So we are talking about less than 5% that goes to the EU. So for them, it will be business as usual, simple as that. So that's why we need, attacking the problem through other angles. Finance, who are finance them? How we can leverage this to change? Consumers, how the consumers can ask for the prosecutors in Brazil are doing a great job in sort of like getting them to commit and implement their commitments. Also the government through command and control and through voluntary commitments. So I think all of that in the context of the EUR, nothing will change, business as usual. In terms of the trade agreement, I mean, what a complex question. I think it's a very diplomatic question, to be honest. We've been seeing now the government of Brazil saying or being vocal that the UDR and the trade agreement are imposing trade with environmental criteria goes against sovereignty. So we are seeing this more and more coming from the Brazilian side. But I think there is a great opportunity for the EU using the UDR, using the Mercosur and EU agreement to really engage with the government, Brazil, seriously, to really implement the Article 30 of the UDR, which is about cooperation, to use the leverage of the UDR, the trade agreement, to provide financial incentives for producers to implement the forest code in a meaningful way. Because Brazil, we're talking about Brazil here, as I said, has all the systems there in the forest code, all the mechanisms. So it's just about having the resources and the capacity to really implement and enforce the law. So I think it would be really up to the dialogues and the diplomacy to make the best of these opportunities.
Perfect. Thanks, Andre. We are in a very tight time schedule today, so we've got 4 more minutes. And what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up. I'm going to invite the 3 speakers who are still with us for 1 minute, perhaps an insight or a key takeaway. Rachel, then Andre, then Aline. And then I'll say a 1 minute piece as well, and then some practical information. We will probably go for a tea or a coffee straight afterwards. So it feels like there's a lot here, and we've got into some deep stuff, but there's a lot to it. So we welcome you to join us for further discussion straight afterwards. But Rachel, firstly, thank you so much for joining us from Cambridge. Thanks for your insights. A mixture of concerns, but also some optimism on the horizon. One takeaway for us to take from today, please.
The takeaway would be that this is an important regulation that's definitely going to have some major impact on the way that business is done. It's unclear how much is going to be positive and how much is going to be negative. I tend to be optimistic, and I think that although there's a limited market scope and although that there's leakage, there are important ways that it can change the structures by which businesses operate, and that can be good. But unfortunately, hasn't changed much about the narrative, which is that Brazil and other deforestation risk countries are responsible for solving these problems and not us in the global north. And we need to put our money where our mouth is and support them with developing a new vision and a new economy.
Thank you. Andre.
Two quick points. One, I think other wooded land has to be in the law. I mean, this is clearer for everyone. Finance also, how to bring finance into this law as well, into the UK bill that is coming up. But my second point is we need more attention to the legality aspect of to the compliance with national regulations. In the case of beef, there won't be much impact because EU doesn't import a lot of beef. In the case of soy, a lot of the soy in Brazil, in the context of Brazil, is deforestation free already. So how about implementation of the forest code? And we are seeing that this is a much bigger risk. So I wanted to bring to the radar as well.
Before my final words, I just want to say that this is an ongoing research, and there are a lot of results for companies and calculating risk per company. So they maybe in another webinar, we are going to touch more on the company side. Be tuned. But final words, zero deforestation is key for Brazil to reduce its emissions, comply or achieve its net zero targets, but also to curb biodiversity loss, to keep ecosystem services, and to adapt and create resilience against climate change impacts. And this all speaks directly to the future of agricultural sector in Brazil. The enforcement of national policies, they are crucial to curb deforestation. We know the forest code is not going to be enough for certain areas like Cerrado in Brazil. It's a biodiversity hotspot and disappearing at alarming rates. And we need a portfolio of governance, and the UDR could promote this positive chain reaction, could help national initiatives, push other markets to follow similar legislations. And overall, I think the UDR is pointing to the right direction, but still it needs to be improved. Other wooded land should be incorporated, financial mechanisms, and as I said before, a benchmarking system to classify companies would be super important. And it's our job to identify these indirect effects and make recommendations.
Great. So just a couple of words of wrap up and maybe just trying to recapture the story we've shared with you today. I think the first is the EUDR is unique. It's the first kind of legislation of this nature. We are hopeful that it's going to be game changing, and we've set out ways today in which we think it can be game changing. Details are important. So the other wooded land is important, including that could have a 7-fold increase in its impact, particularly on soy. Rachel's point about risk benchmarking. So do we call Brazil a high risk country, or do we have a bit more detail around state level risk as well? This is really important in terms of the way it's going to be implemented. And China is really critical in terms of the role that it could play, inspired by what's happened from the EU legislation. Aline, you used the word chain reaction when you first spoke as well. So, what are those chain reactions that could come out of this legislation? I think one, Fabiola talked about this. A lot of really important legislation exists in Brazil, and under the new Lula administration, a lot of activities in scaling up deforestation, combating deforestation is happening, whether that's through those plans for deforestation, the PPCDs that she talked about, or whether that's through restoration plans, the Plano Verde. I think the existence of the EU legislation puts pressure on China, whether directly or indirectly, right? Because you've got this benchmark now around what importing deforestation can look like. And there's also a perception issue in Brazil. I think we're moving from a, potentially a climate where illegality is acceptable to a climate in which companies and all players in the agricultural supply chains really have to demonstrate benchmarking in terms of legal compliance. So I think just to end with very much a note of optimism and taking, I think, what Rachel said, moving from soft laws to hard laws as a game changer. Companies now being held accountable. Responsibility has to be shared. So it can't just be a top-down legislation from the EU to Brazil. Responsibility has to be shared. And I think the need for a vision is really critical. That's one of my key takeaways here today is, what is the vision for the Amazon? What is the vision for sustainable and responsible agricultural and commodity supply chains as well? And I think building that collectively is a key to moving forward. We'd love your feedback on today, whether you're online or here in the room. So you'll see on the screen now, click on this QR code. We welcome your feedback. We're always trying to improve these webinars as well. So please tap in on that QR code and give us your thoughts. Suffice it to just thank our four fantastic speakers, Aline, Fabiola, Andre, and Rachel. Thanks to the support team at the University of Oxford, George, Kath, and many others of you who've been here today. And thanks to our hosts at the Western Library and the University of Oxford. Finally, we have another webinar next week in this series, Net Zero for Influenced Emissions, the role of global professional service providers. Do join us online or here in person in Oxford. Thanks for your time today, and join us for a tea or a coffee straight afterwards to carry on the discussion. Thank you.